Hi, I'm Effie, and if this is your first time coming across my channel, welcome. I predominantly make bookish content, but I do sometimes make FlossTube content, and occasionally the two cross over, which is what today's video is all about, as I'll be talking about the book blanket that I'll be making for the books that I read this year. My best friend, who has a channel where she also makes bookish and FlossTube content, recently started learning to crochet. Despite the fact that I've been crocheting for several years now, I'd never attempted to make a granny square. So when Shannon was trying to figure it out, I got the bug and decided that I wanted to try making one. But also, I wanted to get a feel for the pattern in case she had any questions. Shannon is incredibly talented and her skill at the craft is far surpassing mine, so definitely subscribe to her channel to see all of the cool things that she makes. So, my book blanket. This is not a unique concept, and using granny squares to make one is very trendy this year, which I absolutely love. I've wanted to make a book blanket for years, however, in recent years, it's just not been something that is feasible for me, because it's not unusual for me to read over 200 books in a year, which obviously is a lot of stitches and a lot of rows, and I know myself well enough at this point to know that this would just be setting myself up for failure. Granny squares though seem to be a great solution, as each one works up in around an hour. And because I wouldn't join them all together until I had the whole year, it wouldn't become an unwieldy beast of a project. I am going to be completely honest, I basically decided that the very first granny square blanket pattern that I found was the one for me. And that is the pattern from All About Amy, which I'll be using to make each of the squares. Since I knew I wanted each granny square to represent a single book I read in 2024, again, not a novel concept, I know a number of people are doing this, I needed to decide on what weight of yarn I would use and what hook size. My yarn collection is mostly double knit with a couple of random balls of different weights. I thought the super chunky could be fun, but I very quickly realised that I didn't enjoy working with it. I think the plastic hook created too much tension, but also each individual square was way too big for it to work if I was going to have 200 plus books by the end of the year. But I do like the idea of doing a version using this yarn just for fun down the line. Double knit became the obvious choice, but I needed to decide what size of hook before I could start. I like the looser look of the finish with the 6.5mm. However, I ultimately decided that it would be better to use a 4mm crochet hook, as the looser finish might not look as intentional. It also makes a slightly smaller square, which is a positive, as I still have some concerns about just how big the finished blanket will be. The finished size of each of my sample granny squares was 29 centimeters for the super chunky square, 11 centimeters for the square where I used double knit with a 6.5mm hook, and 9 centimeters for the square where I used double knit with a 4mm hook. Whilst I knew each granny square would represent one book, I needed to decide how they were going to do that. I decided that since Amy's pattern was essentially 3 elements, the center, the petals, and the border, I would use each element to represent a different stat about each book. It was decided that the centre would represent the length of the book, the petals would be my star rating, and the border would be the genre of the book. After trying out a few different colour combinations, I decided that the most cohesive colour palette would be to use yellows and oranges for the centres, pinks and reds for the petals, and purples for the border. I decided that I wanted outliers, more on what those are in a second, to stand out, so I decided to use different shades of blue to represent those on my blanket. I won't get into the full process for deciding exactly which colour yarns I was going to use, which was very type A and involved some photo editing software, some Gaussian blur and a colour dropper. Basically, I ended up deciding to get 20 different yarns, which were a combination of Stylecraft Special Double Knit and Paintbox yarns Simply Double Knit with one James C. Brett Super Soft Baby Double Knit thrown in for good measure. All of them were bought from Lovecrafts. So let's get into the colour scheme. As I mentioned earlier, the centres of the squares will represent the page length of each book. For a book that is under 100 pages, the yarn I will be using is Lemon from James C. Brett Super Soft Baby Double Knit. For books that are between 101 pages and 200 pages long, I will be using Daffodil Yellow from Paintbox. Books 201 to 300 pages long will have a centre with Mustard Yellow from Paintbox. The centre colour for books between 301 and 305 pages long is Glorious Gold from Paintbox. For books which are 351 pages to 400 pages, I will be using Clementine from Stylecraft. And for books with lengths of between 401 and 500 pages, I will use Spice from Stylecraft. Moving on to the petal colours, which represent my rating for the books, I'll be using Clematis from Stylecraft for books which I gave a rating of under 1 star. I rate using quarter stars, so for books where I've given the book a rating of between 1 and 1.75 stars, I will use Bubblegum Pink from Paintbox. For books where I rated between 2 and 2.75 stars, I will use Lipstick Pink from Paintbox. If my final rating for the book was between 3 and 3.75 stars, I will use Rose Red from Paintbox. Where I rate a book between 4 and 4.75 stars, I will use Red Wine from Paintbox. And now we are onto borders for the granny squares. The borders represent the genre for the book. This was probably the category that I had the hardest time figuring out what I was going to do with, because there are so many different genres, but in the end I decided that I was going to assign colours for my most read genres and then have an other category for anything that falls outside of that. I decide what genre the book falls into on basically gut instinct. For books that are romance, I will use Violet from Stylecraft. For books whose primary genre is fantasy, I'll use Lavender from Stylecraft. For books that fall within the genre of mystery and or thriller, I'll use Wisteria from Stylecraft. For books which largely fall into the horror genre, I will use Parma Violet from Stylecraft. For books which are short story collections or anthologies, what even is the distinction between those? I'll use Pansy Purple from Stylecraft. The last genre isn't really a true genre, and that is vampires. I decided that I wanted to track this as a genre because it felt as though it would be interesting to be able to look at my book blanket and immediately recognise just how many vampire books I consumed in the year. My guess, I think there's going to be a lot. For this genre, I'm using Emperor from Stylecraft, which is a really dark purple that in some lights even looks black, which I think works really well in the context of it being used to represent vampire books. For the outliers, I chose 3 shades of blue, so one for page length, which is a fairly light blue, called Cloud Blue from Stylecraft. This will represent books that are over 501 pages long. When it comes to star rating, either end of the rating scale could be seen as outliers, but I particularly wanted to highlight books that were 5-star reads, so I'll be using Bluebell from Stylecraft for books that fall into this category. In the case of genre, I feel like it's less of a continuum. So what is classed as an outlier is any book that doesn't fall into one of the 6 earlier defined genres. This will be my other category, and I will be using Lapis from Stylecraft for it. If your yarn stash is anything like mine, you'll know that balls really like to lose their sleeves with all of their helpful information on, and then you just end up with a container of very colourful yarn that you have no idea what colour, brand or dye lot it is from. I can't remember who I saw doing this, but I saw someone who essentially creates index cards for each of their balls by hole punching the collars for their yarn balls twice, one hole to tie a piece of the original yarn and one to attach it to a binding ring. I'm going to try my hardest to keep the collars on my yarn. However, I did decide to make mini index cards inspired by this idea, which should be particularly helpful when my yarn collection inevitably descends into chaos. So that is my plan for making a blanket to represent all of the books that I read in 2024 using a granny square pattern from All About Amy. I'm hoping that I can stick with it. I'm definitely very excited by this project, and it feels quite manageable as I can dip in and out, just creating squares when I have a spare minute, or more likely hour, but you know what I mean. If you're interested in following along, I will be updating in my FlossTube whip parades, which I'm currently putting up, or at least aiming to put up, every other month on my channel. I'm also hoping to have a dedicated video showing the final blanket around the start of 2025, but obviously that's very dependent on my actually keeping up to date with making the squares. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Happy stitching. Bye!